It's a real pleasure to come back. I was here, as Jessica said, in 2014. So I've been running this project. The project dates are 2014 to 2021. So I was here right at the beginning in 2014 talking about some research that I had already done on the role of the city of Vancouver in the dispossession of the property of Japanese Canadians in 1943. And now I'm back 7 years later at the end of this project that's wrapping up. And so it's a real nice bookend for me. Would have been even nicer to be in person with you as I was in 2014, but it's wonderful to come back again to the Historical Society and to talk a little bit about the research findings of Landscapes of Injustice, but also the project itself and the origins of the project. So in the background of everything that I'll talk about tonight was the decision in 1942 by the Canadian government to uproot and intern all persons of the Japanese race. That was the language of the law, living in coastal British Columbia, which was almost all Nikkei Canadians or Japanese Canadians at the time, to uproot and intern them after Canada entered into the war in the Pacific in that year. And at the same time as uprooting the population, the government seized all the property of Japanese Canadians. So here I'm talking about real estate, but also personal belongings and other forms of real estate like houses, but also businesses and farms, but also clothing and dishware and automobiles and fishing vessels and any form of property that Japanese Canadians weren't permitted to take with them to internment. And in 1943, the government made the decision to force the sale of all of that property without the consent of owners. And this meant, of course, that when internment finally ended in 1949, in April 1949, when Japanese Canadians were permitted to go anywhere in the country again, to return to BC if they chose, they had nothing, or coastal BC, they had nothing to return to. And I'd note that date also, 1949, right from the outset. 1949 is when the last aspect of those internment laws comes to an end. Most of Canada's internment era, as I think of it, was post-war. So this was a policy that started during the Second World War, but it's not a Second World War policy. It's a policy of a decade, a policy of the 1940s. So Landscapes of Injustice has been this 7-year project that has run precisely from when I was with your group last to just the present moment, more or less. It's sort of in a slow wrap up, I guess, to investigate the dispossession of the property of Japanese Canadians, this loss of home, loss of possessions, loss of belonging, and to center an analysis of the era on that aspect of Canada's policies. It was our impression at the start of the project, it was my impression that certainly historians informed in the area and many Canadians knew that the government had uprooted and interned Japanese Canadians, but that there had been much less attention to this destruction of the homes of Japanese Canadians, which was to some extent unique. We're just getting to know, or I'm just getting to know, a global context of Nikkei internments in the 1940s, but to some extent unique in that Japanese Canadians, the majority of them were British subjects of Canada, either born or naturalized, people who had been here for a long time. And Canada was somewhat unique in the scale at which and the totality with which it dispossessed people who were Canadians, who were citizens in the language of the time. That didn't happen in the United States, and many of the other dispossessed Nikkei people were not citizens of the places where they were dispossessed. So there's, in some respects, this is a unique aspect of the Canadian history and a really powerful dimension of the experience for Japanese Canadians and a huge undertaking for the Canadian state. So our project asked, in a sense, what if we look at this history that's known, a known history in Canada from this alternative perspective? What if we look at an era that's primarily been known for the internment camps from the perspective of the permanent destruction of home. And that's what our project has endeavored to do. So yeah, this is the question that animates the project. How might we see this history differently, the history of Canada's internment era, if we view it from the perspective of the permanent dispossession of Japanese Canadians? And so this perspective draws our attentions to sources like this one, which is a government document from the agency, the custodian of enemy property, that was responsible for Japanese Canadian property during the war and after. And this is a map that officials drew of a farm on Salt Spring Island that belonged to Tsunetaro Murakami, who wasn't one of the famous Murakamis on the land on Salt Spring Island. It was a different family, and he owned this property. He was in his 60s in the early 1940s, and had a son, Peter, in his 30s, and might have imagined retiring from active farming, I'm not sure, or passing this property to his son. Instead, it was seized and sold in 1944 for a little over $1,000 at the time, or $17,000 in our present currency. Well, over the next 30 years, so what I think of as a generation, maybe that period in which Peter would have owned the property, that piece of land, which is near the country grocer, for those of you who know Salt Spring Island, across the road, kind of down the road from the country grocer, was subdivided and sold in lots for $3 million in 2021 dollars. If Peter, Tsunetaro's son, had been able to hold on to even one of those lots, he would have had a much richer inheritance than what he ended up with as a result of the forced sale of this property. And of course, the people who had the opportunity to acquire the property through this transaction benefited greatly, as did people who bought from them. So a focus on dispossession draws our attention to documents like these and the story they tell, both about the Murakami family and about the purchasers of this property. It draws our attention to thousands of records of the dispossession of all forms of property that Japanese Canadians had, and the very elaborate bureaucratic entities that existed to oversee this process. And here you can see mostly images, case files of the custodian of enemy property, and there are thousands upon thousands. The sheer scale of the endeavor really comes to light within these files. Our attention is drawn to other forms of property as well, the over 1,000 fishing vessels that were seized and sold against the consent of fishers. And really, in the history of dispossession, there's all kinds of forms of property, really everything you can see on these slides. Not every Japanese Canadian owned a fishing vessel, not only a minority of them owned real estate, but all of them owned property that was seized by the federal government and sold. In the upper left on my screen, dishware was sold, dining room tables and chairs, children's dresses and adults' clothing. Moving down on the screen, pianos were sold, and dolls and dresses and curtains and picture frames. The stock and trade of businesses was seized and sold without consent. Bicycles were sold. I'm moving to the right here across the screen, and children's clothing again, and shoes were sold. And in the bottom right, Akichi Kagetsu's large lumber operation and land holdings on Vancouver Island were sold to Macmillan Bloedel. And the emphasizing dispossession brings to light, the impact of these kinds of losses, what it means to have your whole house emptied out and forcibly sold. And keep in mind also that the kind of a market that might exist for all of your personal belongings in your home if they were dumped onto a market without your consent. Many of those things that are valuable to us every day just don't have a resale value. There isn't a market for my clothing or my shoes, but I needed every day to get dressed and to wear on my feet. So what happens to someone's life when you take all of that stuff, dump it into auctions, hundreds of auctions and forced sales, neglect the care of it, let it be destroyed, let it be stolen, and how do people recover from that? What is the impact within their lives? The dispossession brings all of this to light. I want to talk now, I think I'm coming back out of PowerPoint. I want to talk about the origins of this project for me before I get into some of our findings that we had and the approach that we took. So this project began in a fight that I had with Robert MacDonald, who is, I think, known to many of you here, the late, great Robert MacDonald, the wonderful BC historian who was the host for many years and my host in 2014 when I came to talk to the Historical Society, and really a major figure I know in the history of this organization and also a major figure in the history of British Columbia. And maybe some of you had, like me, the experience of a quite acrimonious exchange with Bob MacDonald, and that is what I had and how I got started on this on this project. In fact, so I wanted to tell that story. I haven't had the chance to tell it in public, and I think it raises some interesting issues or questions about how history is done as well. So. This fight happened in New Brunswick in May, I think it was May 31st. I looked up the program, May 31st of 2011. I think the fight happened at about 6:45 in the evening, because at about 6:30, just before the argument we had, Bob was being given an award for a lifetime contributions to the history of British Columbia. And after that award ceremony, which was supposed to wrap up at 6:30, let's assume it went a little bit late, we started wandering down the hill at the University of New Brunswick down into town, where we were going to have what turned out to be cold lobster on ice that we dipped into hot butter, which was a real revelation for me. I'd never had lobster cold, and if you haven't had it, it is wonderful. But I arrived angry to that lobster as a result of the conversation I had with Bob on the way down the hill. It was a beautiful afternoon. The sun was kind of low in the sky, and Bob and a graduate student were there along with me, and we're walking down. I think I congratulated Bob on his Lifetime Achievement Award, and Bob turns to me very unhappy with the presentation that I had given at the conference that year. And Bob was someone who I think probably under all circumstances was willing to give people constructive feedback and criticism on their certainly their work in the field of history. And I like to think that maybe because he had received this Lifetime Achievement Award, he was especially inclined to dispense advice on that particular evening. So he says, "You can't give the presentation that you gave. You can't give that presentation, and you can't publish on that material. First, you have to go to Ottawa." And he was talking about a presentation that I had given on the forced sale of property of Japanese Canadians. It was the very first analysis I did in the area. And it was really a sort of a side venture on another project I was trying to do on Vancouver real estate. And I thought, oh, you know, I knew from teaching the field that we didn't know who had bought from the custodian. So the kind of information that I had there on that first slide of the properties on Salt Spring Island, historians hadn't done that kind of analysis. We didn't know who had bought from the custodian or what they had done with the real estate that they purchased. And I had done this title research for other reasons in the East End of Vancouver. And I saw that we could answer that question in the title research, this kind of history of one sale after another on really hundreds of properties in the East End of Vancouver, or present-day downtown East Side, where the largest pre-war Japanese Canadian neighborhood had been. So I thought, oh, it would be a contribution to the field. While I figure out what I'm doing with the rest of this real estate data, I'll do a little paper on who bought from the custodian. there was this assumption in the scholarship that people had bought for low prices and flipped them for a profit. Was that true? You know, the evidence on Salt Spring Island suggests in some cases it was. This was work on Vancouver. Was that true? And so I analyzed some preliminary data and presented at the conference. So Bob says, you can't do this. He says, you need context. You need to go to Ottawa and you need to see the records of the agencies that ordered these sales. And an historian can't talk about a narrow group of sources like that. An historian needs to know context. Now, as it happened, I had just been promoted to associate professor just maybe weeks prior. So my feeling was that the profession was kind of stuck with me, and UVic was stuck with me. I was tenured, associate professor. And so no one could tell me what I needed to do for my research anymore. So I said to Bob, he said, you have to go to Ottawa. And I said, yeah, I might go to Ottawa. Or I might just publish off of this material. And he says, no, you cannot publish off of this material. You must go to Ottawa. And I said, thank you for the suggestion, and maybe I will, or perhaps I won't. And this became heated. And the graduate student who was walking with us slowly made his way away from us to distance himself from these arguing professors on the way down the hill. And we went back and forth on this. And to some extent, we were arguing about a deeper view of the discipline, I think. And there was probably also a personal aspect to it as well. So there was an argument there about the way that historical knowledge gets made. That from Bob's perspective, Bob was thinking of the historian who publishes a big authoritative book on a given topic, who knows everything that they could possibly know about that topic and offers a definitive interpretation. And I don't think Bob would have ever thought it had to be a final interpretation. There would be further conversation of that topic, but it would be as big and expansive, as many stones, looking under as many stones as possible on that topic to know it as well as anyone could at that time and place from that perspective. And that's when an historian published, and that this was slow, painstaking work to become that kind of historian and publish that kind of historical work. And he was saying to an extent, slow down, young man, take your time and figure out the context. And I was articulating a somewhat different view of the discipline where I had conducted research that I knew hadn't been part of that story yet. And I could make my own limited contribution. Maybe this is the kind of historian who published articles. This is the kind of historian who is maybe a bit more of a social scientist, imagining that my work on land title might perhaps prompt someone else to go to Ottawa, and that together we would build in smaller increments a body of knowledge collectively, and that's how history got made. And underlying those kind of philosophical claims were interpersonal claims as well, where Bob was a slow historian who worked for decades to produce books that he hoped were authoritative. And he has a book, I understand, coming out now, being brought out after his unfortunate death. And he was saying, historians should be more like me. And I was sort of arguing, Bob, why take so long? Once you have something to contribute, let's hear it and we can be in conversation about it. Why should it sit in your desk waiting so long? And so there was a personal dimension to that too. When we got to the bottom of the hill, we had not resolved our differences, and we did not, I have to say, part on amiable terms. It was a hot parting of the ways onto Cold Lobster. And maybe some of you had this experience with arguments with Bob as well, but it bothered me. It stuck in my mind. It continued to disturb my rest, and bothered me through my dinner and into the summer that followed. And I would happen to find myself on the East Coast for other reasons. And I said, oh gosh, I'll just go to Ottawa and I'll see those records, and then I'll stop being bothered by this kind of noise of Robert MacDonald in my head. And I got there and I opened some of the records dealing with the dispossession of property, and they were staggering in how much there was, how fascinating they were, how baffling aspects of them were. There were records about a Japanese Canadian who had participated in the dispossession of Japanese Canadians in committees that oversaw the forced sales. I'd never heard of him before. I didn't think he'd ever been written about, and in fact he hadn't. And they were just intriguing records. So I wrote Bob an email. I said, you were right. I'm glad I went to Ottawa. And from there, started on a path that started the Landscapes of Injustice project. The first thing I did was go to the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, where they had the personal records of that individual, Kishizo Kimura, who had participated in the forced sale of the community's property. And those were amazing records again. And there I had very different kinds of conversations with folks at the Nikkei National Museum, Linda Komodo-Reed and others, who conveyed to me the richness of the records that existed at their institution also, but also the deep interest and anger within the community about the dispossession of property. That this didn't seem to fit at all within any kind of security measure. Why, after people were uprooted and interned, their homes and farms rented to tenants, why did their property have to be sold against their will? And so I got a sense of a much larger story in which I could partner with others to tell this big story. And so we started to build a partnership, and I'll go back to my sharing screen here. We started to build a partnership. And that partnership began with those organizations inside the community. Here you can see the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, wonderful institution. The Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto also came onto the project, maybe the biggest community organization of Japanese Canadians in the country in terms of the number of people involved. The Vancouver Japanese Language School and Japanese Hall in the East End of Vancouver is still there today. It's one of the only properties that wasn't forcibly sold by the federal government. Really fascinating history of how that wasn't sold, and a really fascinating institution. National Association of Japanese Canadians was an organization that negotiated redress with the federal government. They joined our project as well. We were then joined by organizations with mandates that went beyond the Japanese Canadian community, including the Provincial Museum, the Royal BC Museum, that was working then and is still working now to tell a less colonial, less white history of the province, and saw our project as an opportunity to get involved in that kind of work. And the Canadian Museum of Immigration in Halifax, which had just become a national museum and wanted to be able to tell stories of Pacific migration in addition to the Atlantic stories that it had been telling. We were joined by academics across the country and academic institutions. Library and Archives Canada joined the project. We got a big grant, the biggest grant in the social sciences and humanities that is given by our federal granting agency, a partnership grant for 7 years, 2014 to 2021, $2.5 million to undertake a big partnered project, and all of it was hosted out of the University of Victoria, the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, where we have our office. And Mike Abe, who's going to post some things in the chat while I talk, is project manager and my partner in all of this work. And he has his office there at the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, which is a wonderful center. And of course, the history department and other units on campus were supporting us as well. Our project was founded around this, as you can tell from sort of how it started. It was founded in this ethos or commitment to community engagement. And you can see a couple of members of our larger team here in this image. Art Mickey, who was the president of the NAJC in 1988 when they negotiated redress, and Audrey Kobayashi, who's a wonderful academic geographer, and also was part of that negotiating team in 1988. And so we were blessed to have the participation of folks folks like that, of Tosh and Mary Kitagawa, who remember the internment like Art does and remember the dispossession. Vivian Ringnestad was the chair of our community council, and I see Vivian is on this call this evening, a wonderful group that contributed to our work. Together, we established a collaborative leadership of this project. So the whole project was run by academics along with museum professionals and archivists and teachers and folks inside the Japanese Canadian community and folks outside of it, a diversity of academic expertise brought to bear on the project and professional expertise. We had a really wonderful opportunity with that funding to involve students in the project as research assistants. We offered over 100 research fellowships to students on the project, and the passion and range of ways in which students join the project and engage the project were one of the real pleasures of the work that we've done. And the younger woman in the upper right there, Nicole Yakashiro, really came back to this history through our project, I think I can say, and she's now pursuing a PhD at UBC, really doing innovative work in the area. The fellow on the bottom right with the longer hair there, Will Archibald. Will was involved in the project in his very early days and really unearthed the details of the bureaucracy that dispossessed Japanese Canadians, and I was really happy to be able to publish with Will on that topic. And so there we are, that one of the meetings. So a lot of our work was done in these big groups together, meeting and discussing this history together. We divided our project into two phases of activity, and the first phase was really a knowledge gathering phase, an insight phase, a research phase where different research leads with different forms of academic or other expertise were involved in leading what we were doing, whether it was continuing that land title research or working in those voluminous government records. We conducted over 100 oral histories. We delved into records that were held within the community at places like the Nikkei National Museum, conducted extensive legal history, including on the legal challenge to the dispossession, that little-known federal law case that challenged the legality of the dispossession. We mapped some of those properties that Japanese Canadians had owned and saw the transition of neighborhoods and places over time. And we delved into the provincial records with the cooperation of the provincial archives to try and examine the provincial role in this history as well. In our work, we tried to situate the history of the dispossession of Japanese Canadians and the internment era more generally into a broad history of racism in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in that mid-20th century in which racism guided so much policy to cause so much harm around the world. We tried to situate the stories we were telling within the longer stories of families, of the homes that they built and the communities that surrounded them, like this family, the Yonoyama family that lived in Haney, BC, near Vancouver, and had a farm of which they were dispossessed. As I've suggested already, we tried to tell histories of the Canadian state, of law, and the bureaucracy, and this is the fellow Glenn McPherson, on which that student, Will Archibald, did so much work, the individual bureaucrat probably most responsible for the dispossession of the property of Japanese Canadians, a policy that he defended until his death in the 1980s. And increasingly, particularly as the research really got going, we uncovered histories of public complicity and accountability. One of the features of this history is to draw our attention back to places like Vancouver. If the internment happened in remote places in the BC interior and elsewhere, the dispossession unfolded right in plain view in major centers of population, and many Canadians, many British Columbians were involved, and many are accountable. And here you can see in the Vancouver Sun in February of 1942, this announcement of a Japanese Canadian store reopening under new ownership of white Canadians. And you can see below that a Chinese Canadian Vancouverite posting a sign to try and protect him and his property from looting and theft that was occurring at the same time in Vancouver. So that was 2014 to 2018. I was really in the thick of it when I was last here. And then around 2018, we started to surface, in a sense, from that intensive research and to generate some results. The first, foundational result was the scholarship itself, some of which Jessica already showed you a couple of. I'm just going to check my time here. Not too bad. The scholarship, she showed you a couple of books. So these are 2 academic books. There were lots of other publications of the project. I'm really proud of these 2 academic books. They're both collective works. In some ways, they strike some kind of balance between what Bob and I were arguing with each other that day in New Brunswick, in that they're works of people working together from different, drawing together different kinds of expertise, but particularly the book on the right, on my screen at least, Landscapes of Injustice, A New Perspective on the Internment and Dispossession of Japanese Canadians, tries to lay out, after having dug as deep as we could in as many sources and with wide a context as we could manage, tries to lay out a definitive, summative statement of our findings. The book on the left, Witness to Loss, is really interesting to me as well. It centers around the memoir translated into English of that Japanese Canadian, Kichizo Kimura, who participated in the dispossession, that person who I talked about. I came to the Nikkei National Museum curious about this individual. So this book includes his memoir, as well as kind of his accounting of the day-to-day activities of the committee, which is a real historian's source. It's not, the memoir itself is often kind of nuts and bolts day-to-day. And then a number of interpretations, a number of interpretive takes by different scholars, and Mas Fukawa, community member and educator, on that memoir. So particularly in the Landscapes of Injustice book, we try to answer the question, how do we see this history differently, viewing it from the perspective of permanent dispossession? And the answer that we try to convey in that book, which is a scholarly book, the answer that we try to convey was the foundation for all of the rest of our knowledge mobilization, our museum exhibitions and websites and teacher resources that I'll talk to you about in a little bit later. So the book and our analysis, our kind of answer to Bob's question, what's our big answer, our whole answer, revolves around 4 major areas rather. The first focuses on the deliberate killing of home, that there was a destruction of home. And that's the foundational claim of the whole project, that there's something distinctive and important about the destruction of home, as apart from the temporary uprooting and internment of people, that the policy created permanently displaced people. And we look in this section of the book and in these parts of our other outputs at how Japanese Canadians had built those homes in the first place and what they meant to them and their culturally specific meanings of the homes that immigrants and their children had built together, and what it meant to have those taken by federal officials. The second part of our analysis is to look into the sustained work that was required for dispossession on this scale. I think still this history is thought of often as kind of a flashpoint or a momentary decision, that in a moment of panic, Canadian officials made what we now understand as a regrettable decision to uproot and intern Japanese Canadians. And that is not the story that the dispossession tells. The dispossession is a story of hundreds or thousands of decisions at every level of the Canadian state to deprive Japanese Canadians of their property, of their homes, of their belongings. And they were not made in panic. These were decisions taken in boardrooms, in discussions of financial and management issues for the federal government. They were not taken in panic. They were taken after Japanese Canadians had already been uprooted from the coast, and no one was afraid that their property constituted a security risk. And there were many, many decisions that affected individual families as well as big policy decisions. And so our second part of our analysis is to try to really detail that work, that bureaucratic work especially, and the work of Japanese Canadians to deal with that kind of interference in their lives, the daily work of being managed and administered in that way. The third part of our exploration is to try to understand the ideas, the rationales, the motivations that underlay this action, which we think of as reasoning wrong, the reasons that officials gave for what they did, and the reasons that Japanese Canadians advanced to contest what was occurring. And so this part of our analysis includes that law case where the government came and made its case, and Japanese Canadians attempted unsuccessfully to overturn the policy. And also this image here, a city inspector in Vancouver. This is the topic I was talking about in 2014 when I visited previously with your group, and the way in which the city's arguments about slum properties, about properties deteriorating in value, were used by the federal government as a justification for the forced sales. And then the final part of our analysis looks at the long-term, the permanent legacies of dispossession and permanent displacement. And so here's a piece of art by Emma Nishimura, who contributed a piece to our museum exhibition that is based on patterns from her family, clothing patterns from internment, sewing patterns from internment, and she's done art to try and deal with the legacies. Well, there are so many legacies of this history. The economic legacies I've already suggested there in that little those maps of Salt Spring Island, emotional legacies, communal legacies, political legacies, who's accountable, and how have we tried to take account of this history, and so on. And so we develop that aspect of this history in this final part of our work. So what have we done then with that, aside from published academic books? We've tried to encourage public discussion around this area. We've had a fair bit of success putting this work into public venues in Canada. This was a really powerful spread in the National Post that might still be available online, a photographic essay that one of their journalists did on the basis of our work. And we got a little bit of international coverage, some interest in Japan in this history in Canada, and ultimately some of our other work, including the museum exhibition, has generated a lot of international attention. And here's that museum exhibit. One of the really wonderful parts of this work of this partnered work has been to have people with other forms of expertise and really talented folks develop the historical analyses that we had into their own modes of expression and interpretation. The museum exhibition, I think Mike Abe, let's just see if it's there. Mike put a video up there in relation to the last thing, but here you can see the tour exhibition. If you look in chat, the exhibition tour, it's just wrapped up its tour in Burnaby. Maybe some of you got to see the exhibition. If you didn't, it is coming back to the Lower Mainland. It's coming to Victoria here. It's coming in Nanaimo, and there's also a mini or condensed traveler. Really beautiful exhibition that tells the history through the stories of 7 families, 7 narrators. And you can see some images of it here. It uses the research. Here's an area where some of the oral histories are presented through a digital interactive. We've coincided with COVID, of course, so it's restricted somewhat the visitorship, but we've had nice visitors in Vancouver, and it's just opening now in Toronto, and I'm really looking forward to it continuing to tour, hopefully post-COVID. For those of you who can't get to the museum exhibition, we did create a website that tried to convey in similar ways this history. So this is our website, and Mike's going to put this is our narrative website. Mike's going to put the link to that in the chat as well. Thanks, Mike. And this explores those 4 themes I've just been talking about. You can see them there on the right. Provides lots of historical examples and documents that you can delve into. There's an interactive timeline of what I think of as the internment era. That shows you that it went all the way to 1952, aspects of the dispossession, and you can see the primary sources there as well. So you can make your own assessments of this history through that site. Teacher resources, been absolutely wonderful to work with teachers at the elementary and secondary school levels. Our amazing elementary school teacher, Greg Miyanaga, created this elementary school resource. If you're a teacher or you know teachers who might be interested in teaching this material, it's a stunning resource for younger students to learn about fair and unfair and home and Canadian history. I'll show you some images of some of the amazing stuff that they do in that group. And Mike Perry-Whittingham, our secondary school teacher, created just fantastic lessons in history and civics and politics and race and racism for the secondary school level. And you can see here in the primary school level just how interactive and dynamic these lessons that Greg created are. They're rooted in historical sources, so everything the students here are doing is rooted in the history itself. And students just do amazing creative work and write letters of protest and just have a really deep, sustained engagement with history through this resource that Greg created. And then the last, and to me, most surprising output of the project and its success is the research database. When we started this project, it was already kind of the digital era or whatever. And so I had a sense if researchers are digitizing all of this material, we should make it available to future researchers and other people. Maybe I was still thinking, in response to Bob, well, someone else will go through these records, and there's lots of records still to go through. And so that's what I thought it was, a kind of a resource for future historians. It's turned out to be a really remarkable resource. Mike Abe, who's the person posting those links, he saw from the outset what this could mean to the Japanese Canadian community. He ran workshops with folks in the community and a number of workshops and a number of community-based events. We've had over 70,000 unique visitors already to our research database. It was launched in March 2021. They can come here and do a general search of the website, but also, and in particular, folks have been gravitating to these custodian case files, records for every single Japanese Canadian family that was up and individual that was uprooted and interned and dispossessed. Often very powerful records, some 15,000 files. They often include letters and testimony and just the sheer details around the property. Really a powerful, powerful resource. And if there are students on this call, there's still a lot of work to be done. All sorts of other approaches that could be taken to those very rich records. Histories that would examine gender, generation, region, all kinds of things that can be done in those and other sources. All of our oral histories are here and available, the legal cases, some of which we've developed, but not all. There's still more work could be done on land titles for the very brave. And this is just a collection from within the case files of letters of protest that Japanese Canadians wrote, really powerful letters there. I'm going to try to slow down. You can see I'm excited about the work that we've done together, but I just want to end with this quoting. I'm going to read this op-ed that we put in the Vancouver Sun. Really, most of the work had been done by this point. There was still some work that was still being done and is still wrapping up. But I was really proud of this op-ed. I wrote it together with the rest of the executive committee of the project, and it was really an opportunity to have our say about what we had attempted to do here and what we hoped we had accomplished. And in particular, obviously I'm not Japanese Canadian, right? This story that I told you, the origin of the project, didn't begin with me in my family, inheriting this history. And lots of the folks on the project weren't Japanese Canadian, but lots of folks on the project were. And I think over the last 7 years, it's been a challenging time to do work in the history of racism, and a rightfully challenging time to do work in the history of racism across these differences of origin and experience that existed on the project. And this op-ed gave us an opportunity to kind of reflect in public. Well, here's how we approached this, and to me it was very meaningful. So I have a print up here of parts of it, and so I'll just read a little bit of it by way of conclusion, and then we can go to Q&A. But we wrote there, my co-authors and I, the work has not been easy. That was a lot of work. Questions abound about who has the right to tell this story. The pain of the dispossession is still felt. Its direct beneficiaries can still be identified. There are good reasons for this history of betrayal to be carefully guarded. Members of our group had to learn to trust that our collective efforts would amplify each voice rather than pitting them in competition. And it was not for everyone. But those of us who persisted in this approach are convinced that partnership across difference is essential to the cause of anti-racism. Working together, our collective told a story that none of us could have hoped to tell alone. In this process, we came to see one another. The results of this work, we hope, are a resource for a more just Canadian future. So thank you for your attention through that lengthy distillation, and I really look forward to your questions.
Wendy's just asking about, yes, the Great Museum in New Denver, which is a great one to add to the list. I know there's actually a map or a tour you can take of the interior. They've created one. I think the language school or someone has created a great driving tour of the interior to check out a lot of different sites and museums. So yeah, there's lots of great stuff. I don't know if that's part of if there's resources on your project too that sort of direct people to other things within, or is it so large?
Yeah, we have a resource page. Yeah. I don't know for sure. The New Denver Museum, if you haven't been there, and if, I don't know, I'm still relatively new to the province, so maybe all the people on a call like this have more experience of the province than I do. But when I did the internment tour, I was, the sites of internment, New Denver and others, but made a really powerful impression on me and our students. And so did the beauty of the interior. I mean, it is an amazing place to visit, and the Nikkei Internment Memorial Center in New Denver is an exact example of that. An amazing place to visit, and that museum, which really needs our visitors. It's a fantastic museum, and so if you have the energy and time to take that long trip, it's really worth it. It's an amazing museum, a really beautiful job they've done. And it's an analog museum. It's not all the digital screens and stuff. It's paper, and you can really see the work that people did to put that together. It's a very human scale of museum. And I saw Vivian, our member of our project, or connected with our project. Hi, Vivian. Mentioned also the Tashmere Museum just outside of Hope, which is much closer to you in the Lower Mainland there. And that's a kind of passion project of someone who grew up connected with Japanese Canadian families, and amazing little museum there. And I think right now it has our condensed Broken Promises traveler there. So you can see our work represented in museum form, and see this wonderful little museum there in Tashmere. Yeah, for sure. Just past Hope. Well, Mike's just put in a really wonderful, I think this is he's put in a really great documentary. I think that's what this link is, that was done on the tea house here in Esquimalt, and the family, the Takeda family that has returned to Victoria, the grandchild of the original owners, and a wonderful guy, Dylan Takeda, is a doctor here in town, and just a really great documentary that they did. So I would really recommend that last link that's been put in there. Yeah. So I mean, Japanese Canadians opposed this policy from the outset and were very attentive to the specifics of the laws that were being generated. And they launched a legal case. They wrote individual letters of protest. They organized communally to resist and to write and to protest. So that's a form of protest we never want to forget in talking about, was there protest, right? There were about 20,000 people who saw this for what it was right from the outset. And then more generally, so outside of the community, there were people in government. I would say the next place where you see really powerful critiques of this policy are people in the federal bureaucracy. And one of the things that's puzzled me, there are folks like John Erskine Reed, who went on to a career in the International Court of Justice, and a distinguished jurist who writes these powerful critiques of the dispossessions. And he's in the Prime Minister's office. Like, he can put these almost on the Prime Minister's desk, or at least the deputy minister, and he does. But he also just keeps coming to work. And maybe that's understandable. Maybe, all of us, or maybe many of us would. I've often tried to kind of imagine, well, what if I was, one of these people, kind of young, ambitious professionals who have gotten this job close to the Prime Minister in the federal bureaucracy. They're making their careers, and some of them see that this is wrong, but they mostly stick with it in the end. You have a meeting and it goes against your view, but you still need to come to work the next day, kind of thing. And then there ultimately is some political opposition, especially in 1945, 1946, and then there starts to be public opposition as well, where opposition parties and also major Canadian newspapers. By 46, people are still being dispossessed, still prevented from returning to their homes. Canada is starting to deport Japanese Canadians en masse to Japan, many of whom have never been there before. And mainstream papers, Toronto Star and so on, start to say, what's going on? What kind of a country is this? And so ultimately, for example, the deportation is halted by public protest, essentially, or political opposition, where the Liberal government has the legal, they fight a court case that goes all the way to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London. They have the legal right to deport as many as 10,000, almost half of the pre-war population. By contrast, the Americans deported less than 1% of Japanese Americans. So Canada has the legal entitlement to proceed with its planned deportation of about 10,000 people, but they stopped due to political opposition. Some 4,000 people were deported before they stopped. So eventually, there's a kind of awakening to the injustice of this. But during hundreds of auctions in Vancouver, when thousands of people were looting the properties of Japanese Canadians, or bidding on their real estate, there's very, very little.
Any last comments? So how about you, Jordan? Where does this all sit with you now? It's great. Thank you as well for sharing the Bob story, because I wanted you to share. It's so interesting, like, you just don't know how these things are going to happen and what happens if you don't decide to research that. And then all of this would have still been possibly not known, right? Or
it's
be uncovered, right? Somebody will eventually, perhaps, but not, you don't know.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and I think of this as partly for me, it's so nice to be back, like I said, after 7 years, and to do this a bit in memory of Bob. What a fascinating character he was, and what an influential historian he's been. And so, yeah, absolutely. There's that human side of how research gets done that sometimes, historians want to appear as if the topics they choose are somehow flow from a pure tree of intellectual integrity or something. But all of these choices are affected by who we are, whether we're studying our own kind of the history of our own families and communities or not, and they happen through these interactions between people, right? And so, yeah. yeah, without that fight, with Bob, I don't think I would have embarked on this path. And then also, all this, I mean, Bob, that he was supportive. He was supportive. I don't want to suggest he wasn't, but also the supportive relationships and conversations I had, particularly with folks at Nikkei organizations who supported this work, all of those, very human relationships, made it possible. And to me, it's sort of like, I don't know how I was spending my time. I don't know how I was doing this work before doing it in really close relationship with other people. Like, I'm just so glad to be doing this work along with other folks like Mike here, who's throwing all that stuff into the chat and everything. Is just for me tremendously enriching. And yeah, sometimes you argue with those people you're collaborating with as well, and sometimes and there are challenges for historians like me that we could just not abstain from that and kind of publish our own stuff independently. But for me, it's very, very enriching. I hope it's increased the impact. It's massively increased my knowledge to work with other people, and I'm just really grateful for the whole journey.